Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar in the Fieldfisher Digital Services Act series. Today we're going to cover the due diligence obligations under the DSA. I'm Kwan Hon, a director in the privacy team in London, and I'm joined by Charlie Guile, a solicitor in our technology, outsourcing and privacy team, also in London. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, this is part 4 of 5 sessions on the Digital Services Act across Fieldfisher's London, Brussels, Germany and California offices. These series are intended to introduce the key concepts and impacts of the DSA in short 30-minute bite-sized chunks, and each webinar also has linked blogs. Next, please.
So in today's session, we will cover what are intermediary services and those general obligations under the Digital Services Act for all intermediary services, and then looking at the obligations for sort of certain platforms falling under those. We've got hosting providers, then online platforms, and then very large platforms. So hopefully in this session, there should be some time for some questions at the end. So please do use that sort of questions function on the GoToWebinar setup to send over any questions you may have during today's session. So over to you, Kwan, to get us started.
Okay, so what are intermediary services? They're caching services, mere conduit, and hosting services. And these terms will be familiar from the EU e-commerce directive, which is now many years old. And they're also going to be used in the Digital Services Act. They have explained that this concept can include more modern types of technologies like wireless LAN, DNS, top-level domain registries, certificate authorities, CDNs, content delivery networks, voice over IP, IM, instant messaging and chat, webmail, etc. But there's 2 aspects which are relevant here. The first is that hosting has been expanded to include online platforms and very large online platforms, and maybe one should say subdivide rather than expand. And the second is that obligations are going to be imposed on these 3 classes of services. Now, previously, they had exemptions or immunities or defenses from liability in order to promote e-commerce in the EU, and this has already been covered in a previous webinar in this series. But today, we're talking about the obligations that are going to be imposed on these platforms. And by way of recap, caching is simply temporarily storing data in the course of transmission. Sorry, that's mere conduit. Caching is the temporary storage of data, and hosting is the storage of data for users. And in this case, just to briefly mention, very large online platforms are basically those with monthly average users of about 45 million, which is meant to represent 10% of the EU population. And I should just briefly mention there are other hosting services like Pure Storage, which are not considered online platforms. So basically, we are focusing on the obligations on caching, mere conduit, and hosting, in particular, including online platforms and very large online platforms. Now, I think that the obligations for all intermediary services, we should emphasize that there are certain obligations which apply to all of them, and then there are others which apply only to hosting services and then only to online platforms, etc. So for the services that have to comply with all obligations under the DSA, the first point to mention is that because the DSA has extraterritorial scope, if you're providing intermediary services in the EU, you have to appoint an EU representative if you don't have an EU establishment. So interesting differences is that liability of representative is clearer here compared with, say, the GDPR, where it's not clear whether the representative in the EU has liability under the GDPR. Here, a representative is actually going to be liable without prejudice to the liability, of course, of the service provider. So there might be some interesting discussions about indemnity and insurance in that context regarding EU representatives. Also, it's made very clear that if a service provider who has to appoint an EU representative doesn't do that, then actually every single member state can go after it. And this is one aspect of the one-stop shop, which wasn't really clarified in the GDPR. The one-stop shop means basically that for a non-EU service provider, it can be subject to the jurisdiction of only the member state where it has its main establishment, its HQ, or where it has appointed its representative, which allows perhaps a degree of foreign shopping. But if you don't appoint a representative in the EU when you're supposed to, you could be exposed to action from all regulators in all EU member states. Second point is that an intermediary service provider must provide a single point of contact for the regulators and the Commission. And also the language for communications has to be one of the official languages of the country where it has its main establishment or where it's appointed its EU representative. And again, this is going to have a practical impact. I suspect a lot of non-EU service providers might choose Ireland, for example, because of English. Another important aspect of the DSA is transparency. So all intermediary service providers have to produce an annual report on their content moderation, with the exception of small and micro enterprises. And also in their terms, they have to provide information about their content restrictions, their AUPs, which affect content, and their moderation policies and processes, including the use of algorithmic decision making for moderation, and they're required to enforce these terms.
So then moving on to those hosting services and the additional obligations for anything that falls within that category. As Kwan had mentioned, there's a further obligation for those, and here it is to implement accessible, user-friendly mechanisms to allow users to notify the hosting provider of illegal content. And then on receipt of that notification, providers are then obliged to process those notifications in a timely, diligent, and objective manner, which all sounds pretty straightforward. But what's particularly important here is that notices which contain sort of certain information are then deemed to give that provider knowledge or make that provider aware, regardless whether the notice itself is accurate. And on becoming aware or having this knowledge, that provider loses any sort of liability defense or shield in respect of that content. In turn, this should sort of incentivize providers to be actively taking down or disabling access to certain content. And then just finally, when the provider does do this, so it does take some action in relation to that sort of illegal content, it must provide the affected users with what's called a statement of reasons. And the wording of the DSA sort of sets out some of the minimum requirements of what this statement should cover. And these statements will then actually be stored in a public database, which is managed by the Commission. And thinking about data protection here, any personal data which is contained in those statements of reasons will need to be redacted. So again, there's an extra obligation on those providers to ensure that personal data is redacted and the practical consequences of that. And then we go on to one of those subsets of hosting providers which we're looking at is the online platforms. So as the diagram shows, this is sort of the next level of where those obligations come into force. This doesn't actually then apply to sort of the small and micro enterprises. So the term online platforms, just before we get started, is not necessarily what you may think. What we're looking at here is that sort of defined subset of platforms that allow user content to be made sort of publicly available. And for those providers that fall into this, there's quite a host of obligations that they need to comply with. So these are sort of set out on the slide. But this includes implementing a free electronic complaint and redress system for users, which must meet sort of certain requirements. Being sort of able to engage and be bound by sort of any decisions made in any out-of-court dispute settlement. And these out-of-court dispute settlements will be set up by bodies which will be certified by what's called the DSC or the Digital Services Coordinator. And providers will also then be liable to reimburse any costs if they lose any of these dispute settlements. There's also this concept of trusted flaggers. So trusted flaggers will be sort of approved by the DSC or the Digital Services Coordinator and maintained on a public database, which will be maintained by the Commission. But providers are required to sort of implement what they call technical and organisational measures to prioritise any notices which are received from these sort of trusted flaggers. They're also looking at sort of suspension measures, so having in place some sort of measures which enable the suspension for a certain period of time, the services to users who, say, frequently provide illegal content onto the systems, onto the platforms, and also sort of like users who are frequently submitting manifestly unfounded notices or complaints. Coupled with this, the provider's terms must also set out what their policy is regarding this and what they regarding sort of the misuse, including sort of the facts and circumstances that they take into account when assessing misuse and the duration of any suspension. So this is really quite clear for individuals at the outset. Must also have in place the options to be notifying authorities if they become aware of any sort of information which may give rise to a suspicion, so it's only a suspicion, that any serious criminal offence involving a threat to life or safety has taken place, is taking place, or is likely to take place. So it's so that sort of level of suspicion, it seems to be quite a fairly low threshold. And then for those sort of online platforms that allow consumers to conclude contracts with traders, there's going to be an obligation for providers to be actually vetting those traders against certain minimum criteria. So for example, identity will be one of those. And then within that sort of vetting criteria which you've got, a certain subset of that will need to be made available to information. A certain subset of that information will need to be made available to users. And then also the additional obligation on platforms to suspend any traders who have failed to provide complete and accurate information falling within that criteria. And then, so there are further transparency obligations, so the ones that Kwan has previously referred to. So there are requirements to provide additional information in any of their published transparency reports. So this will include sort of the number of disputes, what the outcomes were of any of those dispute settlements, any sort of automated moderation activities that the provider carries out, and a 6-monthly update on the average monthly active users in each member state. And if you remember back to our previous webinars on this relates to the fact that the very large online platforms and what sort of falls into that category is based heavily on what the provider's average monthly active users is. So this will be a nice link there. And then equally, the transparency obligations for any advertising that is displayed on the platform. The providers will be required to sort of name the advertiser and provide what they call meaningful information on the scope of what is used to determine to whom an advert is displayed. And moving on to the next slide.
Right, for very large online platforms, as you can imagine, these have the most onerous obligations. So very large online platforms have to annually conduct, send a copy to the Digital Services Coordinator, the national regulator, and the Commission, and publish risk assessment and mitigations regarding the systemic risk posed in relation to the use of their platform, and an independent compliance audit, all at their own expense. And if the audit makes recommendations, it's negative and it makes recommendations for improvement, then they've also got to actually provide a copy of that report and show how they've implemented it. And if a very large online system, online platform has got a recommender system, including for search, so this is how search results are displayed, how content is displayed to users, the order of presentation, etc., then they have to provide information about the main parameters that determine this ranking or display of different content, and also about user options to change how this is displayed or ranked. And one of the options has to include not profiling. So there has to be an option which doesn't involve user profiling, which the user can select for recommendations. Also, very large online platforms will have to allow access to lots of data on their systems by the Digital Services Commission, Coordinator, the European Commission, and vetted researchers looking into these systemic risks regarding the use of these platforms. We had data protection officers under the GDPR. Very large online platforms under the current version of the Digital Services Act will also have to appoint a compliance officer to oversee compliance with the obligations under the Digital Services Act. There are additional obligations in relation to advertising transparency. So very large online platforms will have to create a repository of information about the ads they've displayed and provide access to this repository through an API. And finally, there's even more transparency requirements for very large online platforms. This report that they already have to publish, which all intermediary services have to be published, has to be published for very large online platforms at least twice a year. So moving on to the next slide. What's next? If you look at the position in the UK, we have the Online Safety Bill. This was mentioned in the previous section, and in fact, I think they were flagging that this is on the horizon. In fact, it already has been issued as a bill, so that's in progress in the UK. In terms of what you should be doing, even though all this legislation is in draft form and it could be changed in the course of being passed, and to be honest, it's very likely it's going to undergo changes because this is very far-reaching legislation, so there will be a lot of attempts to try and lobby in different directions. But you should work out whether you're within scope, and if you fall within scope, where in the matrix, which type of intermediary service provider are you? Look at the obligations you could be subject to and what practical action you might be required to take in terms of terms and conditions, policies and processes, etc. And any lobbying efforts you might want to participate in. In terms of EU legislation, generally it takes, I think the average is 18 months from being proposed and being adopted. The GDPR took 4 years. This is likely to be controversial, so it might well be that it'll take 4 years. Who knows? Moving on, please.
Well, in a first, I think, on webinar series that I've been on, we have managed to bring you back some more time in your day. I can't see any questions that have come in, but please do send them over if you do have any. But that draws us to a close on the fourth part of our series on Digital Services Act. Thank you for joining us again, and we hope you found the session useful. As with our previous sessions, there should be a recording of this on our YouTube channel, and you can obviously catch up with the previous sessions in case you've missed any. But also don't forget, if you haven't already, sign up and tune in to the next session, which will be on enforcement on, I believe, the 27th of May. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, everybody.